In a previous lesson, we talked about once you know what case a word is supposed to be marked as, how you mark it on that word. In this lesson, we're going to talk about figuring out what case a word should be based on how it is used in the sentence. The key concept here is that case follows function. It is the way a word is used in a sentence, whether it's the subject, the object, adjective, or preposition, that determines the case. Case is marked on nouns and adjectives. Nouns and adjectives are parts of speech, and you don't know whether it's going to be a subject or an object until it goes into a specific sentence. Now, parts of speech go into limited slots in Arabic sentences. They can't just be anywhere. And so if you figure out the basic structure of Arabic sentences, you figured out all the possibilities for where nouns and adjectives can go, and therefore that determines what case they can be. This slide shows the basic sentence structures of Arabic. We have two kinds of sentences, equational sentences and verbal sentences. Equational sentences are quite simple. They have a subject and a predicate, and then an optional adverbial. When I put something in parentheses, it means an optional. And the plus on the end of that means you could actually have more than one adverbial. A verbal sentence has a verb and then an optional subject, because with a verbal sentence, the subject can just be built into the verb, an optional object, since not all verbs take objects, and an optional adverb or more. And so that's really all we can have. You can complicate it in various ways with embedded sentences taking the place of the subject and object, etc. But in general, this is what we have for sentences. And so you then ask the question, okay, what can go in the subject position? And this list here is fairly exhaustive. You can have a noun and variations of the noun. In other words, a noun with the article, a noun without the article, a noun with a demonstrative like this, that, etc. You can have a noun-adjective phrase, which again acts as a unit. Instead of just saying the boy, you say the big boy, but it's still one single thing. An idafa is basically just noun-noun. You might call it a noun-noun phrase. The book of the professor. And so, again, it just acts as a unit, is one thing. We're talking about a book, but we're defining that book by saying who it belongs to, the book of the professor. And, of course, it could be a pronoun. The object is very similar. It can be a noun, it can be a noun-adjective phrase, an idafa, or a pronoun. The predicate is a little bit more, has a few more extra possibilities, because besides the things we've already seen, it can be a noun-adjective phrase, an idafa, or possibly a pronoun. But a predicate could also be an adjective, just a plain adjective. And so you can say in an equational sentence, the professor is nice. The professor is Lebanese. Or you can say with an idafa, the professor is the president of his association. Something like that. And you can actually have an adverb or an adverbial. An adverbial can be a prepositional phrase, by the way, as the predicate of an equational sentence. So you can say the professor is from Beirut. And so an adverbial can either be the predicate itself, or it can be added on to the equational or verbal sentence. And then you say, well, what can be an adverb? You can have a real adverb, which is just a word that is an adverb at base. You can also have a noun or adjective in the accusative, like time words, or words like ahyanan. And you can have prepositional phrases, which are basically just a preposition and a noun phrase. So if we look through the list of functions we had in the last slide and say, okay, where in that list is case needed, we see that we need case on the subjects of equational and verbal sentences, predicates if they are nouns or adjectives, all objects of verbs, all objects of prepositions, all second terms of idafa. And you might ask, why don't I have first term of idafa here? It's because the first term of idafa is going to be one of these other things. It's either going to be a subject, a predicate, an object of a verb, or an object of a preposition. But the second term of the idafa needs its own case. Adjectives and non-adjective phrases need their case besides the adjectives and predicates. And adverbials, when they are plain nouns and adjectives, need case. Then we have a few other categories that you should have learned about elsewhere, and if not, we'll just go over it briefly here. We have ism anna. Ism anna is where you have one of the sisters of anna, which would be anna, inna, lakinna, la'alla, etc. preceding a sentence. And in that case, the sentence is required to start with the subject, and that subject must be accusative. And so Ism Anna is like an exception to the subject rule. If you have a sister of Anna before a sentence, the sentence must come right after the sister of Anna, and it must be accusative. Khabar kana is also related to equational sentences. A normal equational sentence has a nominative subject and a nominative predicate, but if you put a sister of kana on the equational sentence, then the predicate becomes what we call a khabar of kana, and it becomes accusative. So these two features, ism anna and khabar kana, change things that are originally nominative, subjects of equational sentences and predicates of equational sentences, and changes them to accusative. Vocative is just the idea of how you address someone. It's usually with the particle yeah, and so the vocative case is the case that comes after, on the noun that comes after the particle yeah. And then you have stray nouns, nouns in lists, nouns in titles, and things like that. The whole idea is that every noun and adjective in any Arabic sentence should fall in one of these categories. This is not a huge list. This is a list that you can master. There's not 100 things to memorize here. As you analyze Arabic sentences and work with them, you should start seeing that the words, even when the sentences are very complex, fall into these categories, and so it's fairly easy to figure out the case. So we're now going to go through the cases one by one and see some examples. So the nominative case marks all subjects of verbal and equational sentences, predicates of equational sentences, whether they are nouns or adjectives, and the normal vocative. In other words, the word after yeah is going to be nominative, although without nunation. Nominative also marks words in lists and stray words, and of course, any adjective in a noun-adjective phrase with a nominative noun is also going to be marked nominative because adjectives agree with their nouns in noun-adjective phrases. And we do have a very few exceptional adverbs that are also marked nominative. So in this slide, we have examples of the use of the nominative case. So here we have هذا الطالب من بيروت. This is an equational sentence. This student is from Beirut. Student, of course, is the subject, and so it's marked with an u, هذا الطالب من بيروت. A similar sentence, the female student is Lebanese, is the equational sentence. So a talibatu is the subject, and lubnaniyatun is the predicate. Notice that the subject is definite, so it doesn't have nunation, and the predicate is indefinite, so it does. The third example is the example of a verbal sentence where we have the student studied in Beirut, darasa talibu fi Beirut. So just like with the equational sentence, the subject is going to be nominative. When you address someone with the particle ya ustadhu, ma ma'na hadhihi al-kalima, what's the meaning of this word? You do it in the nominative, but without nunation. When you just have a word in a list, like student as a random word, then you also mark it as nominative. When you have an adjective in a noun-adjective phrase, then it agrees completely with its noun. So جاءت الطالبة اللبنانية من المكتبة. So Lubnaniya agrees with Taliba. And finally, one example of an adverb that is marked nominative is ba'du, which means yet. So lam tadhhab الطالبة ba'du. So those are some good examples of nominative marking, case marking on nouns and adjectives. The accusative case is used to mark the object of the verb, and then ism anna, ism khabar kana, and interestingly, it marks the vocative if the word after the ya is an idafa. And so as long as the word after the ya is just this plain noun, you use nominative, but if it's an idafa, you use accusative. Adjectives and non-adjective phrases when the noun is accusative, and most adverbs and adverbial constructions have some kind of accusative marking. So here we can see examples of the accusative case. A simple verbal sentence, the student read the book. We have قرأ الطالب الكتاب. Similar sentence, this time with an indefinite noun, كتبت الطالبة كتابا. And similar again, but this time with the tamarbuta, so no extra aleph. أخذ الأستاذ ورقة. The next example is an example of ism anna. you have an embedded sentence, this student is from Beirut. If it was by itself, it would be هذا الطالب min Beirut, but because you're embedding it in قال إن, he said that, this student is from Beirut, the subject هذا الطالب changes to accusative هذا الطالبة. The next example is خبر كان, so you get this, again, equational sentence هذه الطالبة لبنانية. Normally it would be هذه الطالبة لبنانية. This student is Lebanese, but when you put كانت on the front, it becomes كانت هذه الطالبة لبنانية. Again, vocative with idafa, ya Abdullah, not ya Abdullah, because it's idafa, servant of God. And then an example of a noun adjective phrase, shahadtu talibata. I saw the student's accusative because it's the object of the verb. So when you add the adjective al-Lubnaniyata, it just agrees. And then we get examples of adverbs. Here is أحيانا يذهب إلى السينما أحيانا مع إخوته, which is marked accusative, and then a more complicated adverbial, which is tamyiz. Saudi Arabia is the biggest Arab country oil production-wise. It's أكبر الدول العربية إنتاجا للبترول. Genitive case is used to mark the object of the preposition and the second term of the idafa. Those are the two main things, plus, of course, adjectives and noun-adjective phrases with genitive nouns and a very few exceptional adverbs. So, for examples of the genitive case, we start with a prepositional phrase, ذهبت إلى السينما مع هذا الطالب. مع is a preposition, so talib becomes genitive. The next one is an idafa. I saw the professor's book, the book of the professor. So the book is the object of the verb. It's marked accusative, but the professor is second term of idafa, so it's marked genitive. So shahadtu kitaba al-ustadi al-maktabi. That's prepositional phrase. And then example of noun adjective phrase in a prepositional phrase. You get, I put the book on the big table. So tawilati is genitive because it's the object of the preposition ala. Kabirati is genitive because it is agreeing in a noun adjective phrase with tawila. And then an example of an adverb that is marked genitive, amsi. Wasal al-ustad fil matar amsi bil-layl. So this slide gives some examples of case in embedded sentences. The principle here is that nouns and adjectives in embedded sentences get their case from the function inside the embedded sentence and not from what the embedded sentence itself is doing in the main clause. So, for instance, I think we'll look at the second one first. It means the student wanted for his sister to read that book. And so we get أن تقرأ أخته هذا الكتاب. That's the embedded clause. That whole thing is functioning as the object of the verb arada, and talib is the subject. So the student wanted something. That something is the object of the verb. But there's no way to mark an object of the verb on an. And then inside the embedded sentence, you have a verb and a subject and an object. And the subject is just nominative because it's the subject of the verb. The object is an object. And it doesn't really have anything to do with what's going on in the main sentence up here. It has to do with what's going on inside the embedded sentence. We'll look at the first sentence, which is similar. The student bought the book which, okay, and which is an embedded relative clause. So in the main clause, the student is the subject, the book is the object. But then inside the which, you get which the students will read it this year, and the students is the subject of that embedded verb. This year, of course, is an accusative because it's an adverbial of time. Similarly, the student can تستطيع الطالبة أن تشتري الكتاب. That's the object of the embedded verb, not the object of the main verb. الذي قدمه لي صديقها. صديقها is the subject of, again, an embedded verb in the الذي clause. And finally, ذكر الطالب أن أستاذه يريد أن يقرأ لهم كتابه الجديد. In this case, we do have a slight influence on the embedded clause because of the ism anna phenomenon. If you have an, you can't do anything. But if you have anna, you have to change the subject to accusative. So the main clause is The student is the subject, and he mentioned. And then the whole object of what he mentioned is the rest of the sentence, the anna clause. However, that anna clause requires the subject to be following it, and that subject be changed to accusative. So the original embedded sentence might have been yuridu ustadhuhu, and now we have anna ustadhahu yuridu an yaqra lahum kitabahu al-jadida. Again, that's just the object of this embedded verb. So the principle then is that nouns and adjectives in embedded sentences get their case from their function in the embedded sentence and not from the main clause. So for a very quick review, the statements on this page are good to memorize and just to acquire, and they're not difficult. Nominative is used for subjects and for predicates. Accusative is used for objects of verbs, ism anna and khabar kana. And genitive is used for objects of prepositions and second term of idafa. That should cover pretty much all the nouns that you're going to encounter in sentences. Adjectives, if they happen to be in predicates, are nominative, but all adjectives and noun-adjective phrases agree with their noun, either nominative, accusative, or genitive. Adverbs are mainly accusative, with a few exceptional nominative and genitive ones, and vocative, as I explained before, just is normally nominative, but accusative if it is an idafa. So memorize these statements, try to start noticing how that you can fit every single noun and adjective in an Arabic sentence into one of those categories, and that will make the assignment of case fairly easy.